This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza. And right now we're in no man's land.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years with the BBC, Sky and ITN. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I try to provide context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real insight. For this edition, with the double whammy of a budget and a spending review looming, what can we expect from Rishi Sunak? Are our taxes going to go up? Is there any money left for government spending outside the NHS? And has the UK been clobbered by a unique combination of COVID and Brexit? I've been talking to Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, probably the best independent number cruncher on the UK finances. Here's his essential primer on the budget and that spending review. Paul Johnson, thanks very much for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here? We've got a spending review and a budget coming up. How unusual, first of all, is it to have those two happening on the same day?
Well, quite often spending reviews are slated to work on the same day as budgets, but quite often a lot of the information comes out earlier. Generally, spending reviews only come round every 3 or 4 years, though we've had a couple over the last 2 years. So this is the third year in a row in which we've had a spending review, which is pretty unusual. The last 2 years only covered 1 year of spending. We're expecting to get spending plans laid out for at least the next 3 years in a couple of weeks' time. And of course, it does make some sense to be thinking about tax and spending decisions at the same time. Obviously, the amount you're going to spend depends to some extent on the amount of tax you're going to raise.
Isn't the point, though, that we've already had the big announcements, if I can put it like that? I mean, let's start with tax. Are we really expecting bigger announcements than the national insurance rise that we've already had announced?
Well, I'd be astounded, actually, if we get any more tax rises in this budget. Don't forget, we've not only had that big increase in national insurance, which was announced last month by the Prime Minister, we also had some huge tax rises announced in the budget earlier this year in March. Great big increase in corporation tax in particular. So this has already been a record year for tax increases. So it'd be pretty surprising if we got more tax increases announced in this upcoming budget. Of course, there may be some tweaks and fiddles and may even be a few giveaways, but big tax increases I think we can pretty much rule out this time round. And
similarly with spending, haven't we already had the big spending promise as well when it comes to health and social care?
Well, we have. You're absolutely right. I mean, not only that, we've had an announcement about the total, the envelope, the so-called envelope, the total amount that is intended to be spent. And as well as the huge announcements on health and social care, the government's also got a series of commitments on things like schools funding and defence funding and overseas aid funding, which means there's only around a third of the public service spending which is due to be announced at the budget. And partly, of course, that is just because health is such a big fraction of everything that government does. So if you look back 20 years, health spending was about a quarter of public service spending. It's now well over 40% of public service spending. So whatever happens to the health budget really does begin to set the scene for everything else because it takes up such a big fraction of everything.
So I think you said that there was a third basically left that hadn't been allocated already by previous announcements in terms of public spending. Can you give me an idea, roughly how much is that in billions and who's left to sort of hoover up that those crumbs, if I can put it like that?
We're looking at still looking at somewhere well north of 100 billion. So we're talking about reasonably serious money. The biggest of the that is associated with local government, and they always tend to be, or often tend to be, the ones that really do get the crumbs or have the crumbs taken away. But then you've got the sort of things like police and the justice system, further education, and essentially a lot of the parts of the public services that have had the biggest cuts over the last decade. So if you look at where the biggest cuts have happened to things that we all deal with, it has been in things like local government, in further education, actually in the prison system, in the justice system. And I think one of the worries that all of those bits of the public services must be feeling at the moment is so much having already been committed to health and so on, are they once again going to be the ones who get not even crumbs?
I mean, could those departments face a real terms cut because once you've taken inflation into account?
It's possible. My guess is that the Chancellor will try to make sure that they don't, but a lot of his decisions will depend on how positive the economic outlook is, because the amount of money that's knocking around will depend on how well the economy is growing and therefore how much tax he's likely to get in. My best guess is that those departments will get modest and only modest real terms increases in their budgets, but increases at a level that won't be remotely enough to get them back to where they were a decade ago.
Isn't it the case that there is a little bit more money kicking around, that tax revenues have come in a bit faster compared to where everybody thought we would be? Is that the case? And if so, would the Chancellor spend that money, if I can put it like that?
Well, it's you're always getting into difficult territory here in terms of what you're comparing with what. There's obviously a lot less money around than we thought 2 years ago before the pandemic, but there is definitely more money around compared with what we thought a year or even 9 months ago, because the economy has proved more robust so far than expected. And in addition, of course, we've had these huge, and I really do mean huge, tax rises announced over the last year. So compared with a year ago, we've got more money around than we thought. Compared with 2 years ago, less money around. I think one thing that another comparison that we can make is that the Chancellor's spending plans are certainly no more than they were pre-pandemic. So he's not planning to spend any more in 2023 and 2024 than he was planning pre-pandemic. And yet we know that there are going to be significantly bigger pressures on things like the education system, the transport system, the justice system, and so on, not to mention health. So I think it will still feel, despite the fact that we're going to get overall spending rises, it will still feel quite tight.
I mean, do you think he's going to have to come back and say, actually, I need to raise some more money in a couple of years' time? I'm not asking you to look into your crystal ball a bit here, but in terms of the sort of demands there are going to be, even from those other departments, leaving health and social care aside, do you think they might have to be looking at ways of raising more money if they don't want to borrow anymore?
I'd be really surprised if we get more tax rises announced this Parliament, partly for political reasons, partly because we've had this great big increase in tax. And then, what's going to happen to the economy? Well, if the economy does better than expected, and it might, then he's definitely not going to need to raise more taxes over this Parliament. Indeed, I think there's a chance that he'll, coming up to the next election, either not implement some of the increases that he's announced, or find some small giveaways elsewhere. Now, if the economy does a lot worse than expected, then I suspect what we'll end up doing is borrowing more in the short term, not least because he probably won't want to choke off, which is what would already be a very poor recovery, by raising taxes further. So I'd be very surprised if we get more tax increases before the next election. On the other hand, I'd be very surprised if we don't get more tax rises by the end of the decade, and that reflects long-term ongoing pressures on the public finances resulting from this continued increase in spending on health and the broader effects of an aging population, which means more needed for pensions, more needed for social care, as well as for health over the longer term.
I mean, over the longer term, I think the IMF has just said that our scarring, if I can use that word, from COVID is worse than other G7 rich countries. Is that a fair estimate, do you think, of what we've gone through in terms of the economic damage from COVID?
Well, it's really hard to know and to look into that crystal ball. And I think the lesson of the last year is that we've had very little sense of what's happening. I think almost everyone is astounded by the fact that we've got such low levels of unemployment and indeed such a strong labour market. And there's so much going on in the economy at the moment, where the economy is clearly adjusting to some kind of new normal, with more things happening online, adjusting to Brexit and so on. And I think that issue around Brexit is an important one in making those international comparisons, in that we in the UK have an additional issue to deal with on top of the longer term consequences of COVID. So, I don't know the answer to whether we will end up in a worse position to the rest of the advanced economies. I think there's a good chance that we will do, if only because of Brexit. And it really will matter what that long-term scarring is. If that long-term scarring is relatively small, then that will leave us not too much worse off, and the Chancellor in quite a strong position. But if there's a lot of it, then we'll be worse off, and the Chancellor will really be struggling.
Well, let's talk about Brexit, because it's sort of returning, if I can put it that way, to sort of public consciousness again, I think, after going through the pandemic. Can you give us an example of the way that the UK economy has been damaged by Brexit? Because, of course, the ambition was that actually the UK economy would be liberated in some ways and would become more prosperous after Brexit. But is it your view that, at least in the short term, or short to medium term, it's not helping?
Well, look, it's not just my view. I mean, it's a fact. Brexit was always Brexit was never an economic project, and a weaker economy is a cost of Brexit, and the benefits, such as they exist, are elsewhere. Take just one example. Our exports to the European Union have gone down relative to our exports to the rest of the world. That's not something that's happened to other EU countries. They've become more concentrated in the sense that there are fewer companies exporting, because the cost of doing so has become higher. And between them, those will clearly leave us worse off. So there will be a modest but significant long-term cost to the economy from going through Brexit. We're seeing some short-term impacts at the moment. We are suffering worse from some of the supply chain problems, from some of the shortages of both materials and people, than other countries are suffering at the moment. And there will be a long-term impact as well on the size and structure of the economy. That's a choice we've made, but it's one that we will live with.
What do you think has done more profound damage to the economy, Brexit or the pandemic?
Well, in the short run, of course, the pandemic vastly more. I mean, we had the deepest recession essentially in history last year, as the economy was cut down. So in the short run, clearly the pandemic's done more damage, and it's increased our national debt very dramatically, and it's had a big effect on taxes and spending and interest rates. In the long run, more likely it will be Brexit that has the bigger effect, because in the long run, assuming that the virus goes away or settles down, we ought to largely recover from the short-term recession associated with the pandemic. But in the long run, Brexit will always be with us, and that will always make trade with the European Union more expensive, and that will have a long-term effect on our economic output.
And you don't see any sort of corresponding benefit from trade with other parts of the world coming in to compensate for that?
No, I mean it's almost arithmetically impossible. The scale of trade with the EU is so big that you would need extraordinary levels of increased trade with the rest of the world to offset it. And that's not surprising. I mean, the EU is our biggest, richest, closest neighbour and trade partner. So no, it's not plausible that trade with the rest of the world could offset that in total.
One of the advantages the Prime Minister is keen to say is that because of the change of immigration rules and what he would say is the end of uncontrolled immigration, this will start to help boost wages in this country and move the UK economy more towards one that is a high wage, high skill, high productivity economy. Do you see any evidence of that happening?
Well, I think that's a really interesting and complex one. I think that is not impossible. Let me put it that way. The structure of the economy and the labour market was clearly altered dramatically by the levels of immigration from the European Union, with millions of additional people in the country. We obviously ended up with a situation in which we had a different set of industries and a different structure of wages than those we otherwise would have had. And the impact of closing off that route in could be quite profound. Now, we're seeing it in the short run in a negative sense, in that that's behind at least some of the shortages we have in obviously HGV drivers, but also in the social care sector and elsewhere. We have become really quite dependent on this immigrant labour. So what's going to happen in the longer term? Well, I think that'll depend on different sectors. So my guess is that unless we allow more people in or encourage more people in to, for example, do seasonal fruit picking, my guess is we'll just do less of it. That will happen in other countries, and that may be a bad or good thing. I mean, actually, if we don't have the workers to do those kind of jobs here, and people don't want to do them at wages that are competitive, then in a sense, basic economics would tell you, well, it makes more sense to do it somewhere else. So there may be some parts of the economy which just sort of shrink, but there may be other parts where the industry responds in a much more positive way. Because I think there clearly have been issues in some of the, for example, driving or construction areas where there have not been enough UK citizens being trained or getting training or qualifying to do skilled trades, because it's been easier to bring people in from other parts of Europe and other parts of the world. So if in those circumstances companies respond and indeed government responds by doing a better job of training people for those vacancies, then yes, you can see a world in which that results in significant numbers of people having better and better skilled and better paid jobs than they otherwise would have done. So I think this is a really complex issue which will have really quite fundamental impacts on the structure of the economy, just as the very high levels of immigration over the last 20 years have themselves had very profound effects, with winners and losers among the population. And I think some of the losers have been those people who might otherwise have been trained in and doing well in some of those sort of skilled occupations, which we've brought in people from elsewhere. One of the big questions here, though, is whether in the unskilled end of the labour market, unskilled is not the right word, in the low-paid end of the labour market, in things like social care, will we be able to get enough people to do the jobs that we need to do?
It sounds like you think maybe the Prime Minister is onto something potentially here.
Well, as I say, it's a possibility. It's certainly not guaranteed, and it depends to some extent on government policy. One of the risks, I mean, in the short run, I think there's a real risk in talking up pay at the moment, because there's no evidence that productivity in the short run is rising. Inflation is certainly rising and rising to high levels by recent historical standards. What we do not want to get into is a sort of a vicious circle where prices go up, wages go up, and then prices go up some more, and then you kind of get into this this 1970s style cycle of wages and prices going up. High wages must come off the back of higher productivity. Higher productivity needs higher levels of investment, both in infrastructure and machinery and people's skills. So this is something which we should aim for over the medium run. If those wage rises happen quickly without the increase in productivity, that just creates inflation.
final area I just want to ask you about, it does feel, and I think it's more than feels, it seems to be the fact that we are moving to a model of an economy which is a lot higher proportion of the national wealth is in sort of public spending, taxes going up. Do you think this has been just a result of an extraordinary event like COVID, or are we moving into a new kind of world where the expectations of society essentially are that maybe they don't want a small state, maybe they want quite a lot of public spending, and everybody, including the Conservative Party, is recognising that?
Well, I think we're being almost forced into an era of higher spending and taxes. We're being forced there by our focus on and spending on the health service and the additional pressures created by an ageing population. So you're right, tax and spend is rising to high levels by historic standards, though not dramatically higher than we've been used to, but definitely higher. It's not largely driven by the pandemic. It's largely driven by long-term pressures on spending on health, social care, and pensions. Now, we've avoided that for a very long time, having a bigger state. For decades, we gradually reduced defence spending as we increased spending on things like the health service. And then obviously over the last decade, we've had a period of real austerity, really cutting most things back. We've now got to the point, I think, where it's hard to imagine cutting any of those other things very much further. And we have clearly a set of expectations of the health service, which mean that spending on it seems to go up year on year. Spending on pensions will rise, spending on social care will rise in those circumstances, unless we're willing to do something really dramatic, like, be satisfied with some people having to use private healthcare, or like privatizing some of the education system or something. I'm not proposing this. I'm just saying that if we are to avoid a world in which taxes and spending go up modestly and gradually, but go up over time, then we're going to have to take decisions which I don't think we politically want to take. So yes, I think we're going to get used to a higher level of tax and a bigger state modestly, but one that is not going to make most public services feel any better, because it's going to be responding to these underlying demand pressures and demographic changes.
Final thought for people worrying about whether at the end of October they're suddenly going to get walloped with a new tax rise, they shouldn't have to worry about that, in your opinion?
I don't think we're going to get any more tax rises announced in October. People are going to get walloped, as it were, when the the national insurance increases happen next April, and they are personally going to feel the freezing of the income tax personal allowance, which has been announced for the next 3 years. And one way or another, though they may not realizing it, they will also feel the effect of this very, very big increase in corporation tax, because that will either drive higher prices or lower wages, or a lower return on any money you may have in pensions or savings. So even these corporate taxes, I'm afraid, have an effect on people too.
Paul Johnson, thank you very much for spelling all that out for us, and we will see what detail comes out in the budget. But really appreciate you talking to us. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you.
Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. The good news is there shouldn't be any more taxes coming this Parliament. The bad news is there have already been plenty announced, which will kick in soon. But if we want services for an ageing population, we have to pay for them somehow. If you have thoughts on this or any other podcast, you can email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at @AndyBell5News. And please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.